Hello and welcome to News 9. I'm Aditya Raj Kaul and you're watching a special broadcast. India and Tibet have had very important and traditional ties, but Tibet has been back an issue that has been discussed over the last few months after the United States passed a resolution, Resolve Tibet Act. What does this mean for Tibet diplomatically and where do we stand as of now? I have with me on this show the topmost leader, political leader from Tibet, and of course the Tibetan government in exile, the Central Tibetan Administration, the Honorable and His Excellency Sekyong, who is of course the head of the political government and the president. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us. You know, at the very outset, I want to begin by asking you about the Spirit of Tibet festival that just concluded, and in your speech there you mentioned that country should accept Tibet's historical status as an independent nation for China to come on the negotiation table. How significant is this, and could you explain further that if this happens, what is your ultimate objective?
The Spirit of Tibet festival that is being organized at the India International Center is a way to showcase what we have preserved in exile in India and Nepal of what China have destroyed inside Tibet. So that's to showcase to the Indians. And sometimes we believe we live under the illusion that since we have been living in India for so many years, Indians would know about Tibet, but unfortunately that is not really the case. So we have to create more awareness, generate interest, and tell people the story of Tibet. So this is an exercise in that direction. Your question on the importance that we place on the historical status of Tibet, I have repeatedly said that we are still very, very committed to the middle way policy that His Holiness has proposed. Majority of the Tibetans in exile support it, and the Tibetan Parliament in exile has also unanimously approved way back in 1997. And His Holiness reiterated that he will continue with the middle way policy, and this is where we stand. So even though I am the elected political leader or Sekyong of the Central Tibetan Administration or the government in exile, as others refer to us, I cannot change the policy on my own. We have to follow certain procedures, including a referendum, if it comes to that, to change our position on resolving the Sino-Tibet conflict. So since we came into the government, I have repeatedly said that we are committed to the middle way policy because it's a policy that is mutually beneficial for both the Tibetans and the Chinese people. But when we say middle way, which is a Buddhist concept, then you also have to understand that there are polarities or extremities. Because of the extremities or the polarities, you have the middle way. So our reasoning is, if there has to be value or leverage for the middle way policy, then there has to be recognition for the polarities. If there are no recognition for the polarities, then there is no middle way, and there's no value for middle way. So polarities could be defined in many ways: social, economic, education, whole lot of things. But in the political sense, one polarity is the situation, the present situation of Tibet occupied by China in a very repressive manner. And the other polarity is the historical status of Tibet as an independent state. Now, when you read newspapers, comments, analysis in India, also there are many who just consider Tibet autonomous region as right. Tibet, whereas more than half of Tibet is outside the Tibet autonomous region. This is China's perception of what Tibet is. Because whether it's Tibet autonomous region or the other regions that has been incorporated into Sichuan, Yunnan, or newly created Qinghai province and all that, it's all Tibetan people who inhabit these areas before Chinese came in. So the change in strategy of focusing on history based on four main reasons. One is to send a clear message to China that they cannot change history or they cannot distort history on their own whims and fancies or for their own political gain and political interest. The second is to send a message to the international community, because China has been asking every country to say Tibet is part of PRC. Now, without the international community studying Tibetan history, just repeating like a parrot what the Chinese government wants them to say because of economic benefit, does not gel well. Then you become accomplice in China's propaganda. Some countries say we are neutral. If you are neutral, then why you have to make a statement on Tibet at all? Don't side with China, don't side with the Tibetans as well.
Right.
You know? So there are a lot of dichotomies in, or ironies in how governments think. And the third reason is, and so when I travel around, now we have traveled to more than 24 different countries, we have to travel more and reach out. I tell governments that if you keep repeating the statement that Tibet is part of PRC, then where is the reason for China to come and talk to us?
Sure.
You know, first you are becoming a parrot. You don't have a mind of your own. You just repeat what the Chinese government wants to say. And whether it's happening to Ukraine today or whether it happened to Tibet 74 years ago, it was the same international law, because China used force to come into Tibet. And we were also forced to sign the so-called 17-point agreement, which detailed a lot of competencies that are relegated to the Tibetan government. But all these were trampled upon by the Chinese. That's why we had to abrogate that in 1959 when His Holiness came in. That was the only agreement we have with the Communist Chinese. That is one thing. And the second thing, on the one hand, they keep repeating the statement that Tibet is part of PRC, and on the other hand, they say, oh, we support negotiation between His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the representative of His Holiness Dalai Lama and the Chinese government.
Right.
So I say these two don't go together. You are removing the very ground for negotiation. You know, when you keep saying Tibet is part of PRC, then where is the reason for China to come and talk to us?
So since you mentioned the negotiation, I want to ask you, His Excellency, that in July this year, you confirmed that there was a backroom dialogue that was underway between the CTA, the Central Tibetan Administration, and China. Could you share any details that where is this happening? What is the agenda? I know these are sensitive things, but at least something to substantiate at what stage is this dialogue?
Now, if I may complete the former one, the
Sure.
third reason is to tell the Tibetans that if Tibetans don't study Tibetan history, who else will? And what will we pass on to the younger generation? And the fourth reason is within the Tibetan community, just as in every struggle, you have independence seeker, you have the middle way. Of course, middle way is the official position. So even for independence seeker, if they are seeking independence for future, they have to prove the independence of Tibet in the past. So till that time, we are all same. So what we are trying to do is to bring everybody together within the Tibetan community to work together, whether you propose one position or another position. Now coming to your last question, since about more than a year ago when I spoke to BBC Hard Talk, I did commit to having back channels. But then if you ask me, do you have any expectations from these back channels? I say no, because look at what Xi Jinping is doing to Tibet, what Xi Jinping is doing to Uyghur people, Hong Kong, to their own people in China, and then their bellicosity towards Taiwan, and all this doesn't add up to any reasonable thinking that China is willing to resolve the Sino-Tibet conflict. So therefore, when I'm asked, do you have any expectations? I say no, I don't have any expectations from the present dispensation in the Beijing government. But then if you ask me, why do you continue to have these back channels? Then I say it's for the long term. It's not for the short term. Hopefully there will be a Chinese leader with a common sense. Right now, there's nobody in the leadership who has this common sense. If they want to resolve the Sino-Tibet conflict, it's the easiest one, because now His Holiness, because China's main concern is sovereignty, and His Holiness is not asking for separation. But sometimes I really wonder who really wants Tibet to be separated from China. Well, His Holiness keeps chanting like a mantra, middle way, And Chinese keep calling His Holiness a separatist, separatist. So who really wants Tibet to be separated from China? That's also a big question. So of course, I don't want to go into the details of the back channels, but it's there. I cannot lie. So when I'm asked, I tell the truth. But then the levels and all those are still very insignificant. The whole idea is, would it be possible to re-establish contact in the first place? Now, to re-establish contact, you need trust, which is absent. So the back channels are just to convey messages.
You say, sir, that there's a trust deficit. In the backdrop of the resolution that was introduced in the US and of course passed by the Biden administration, because they also said that there should be negotiations and encouraged that China should come forward. Are the Americans facilitating this dialogue? Or
no,
you don't want to confirm
no,
this?
China does not appreciate any third-party intervention. And right now we are not at any stage to involve any third parties. We have not reached that stage also. But the US also, by the Act of Tibet Policy Act of 2002, they also have the mandate or the responsibility to promote negotiation between the Tibetans and the Chinese. So that they keep continuing to do it. But then, the Chinese position, even lately in the Global Times and all those, they were saying we don't recognize this position of special coordinator for Tibet in the US government. So we'll have to see how US-China relations shapes up in the days to come and how it has been in the last few years, particularly from Trump's presidency to now Biden's administration, and then you have elections coming up and there may be a lot of dynamism involved. Just very recently there have been a lot of communication between Jake Sullivan was there in China, his third meeting with Wang Yi, and also met with President Xi Jinping. So all these are still evolving, and when we look at all this, then you also have to understand US policy towards China. That's the larger picture.
And there was an American delegation in Dharamshala as well, which was not taken lightly by the Chinese.
Of course, China doesn't like anything that happens outside, where they are concerned. They will talk about interference and all that. But Speaker Pelosi has been very clear. Many years back, she said, if we cannot talk about Tibet, then we have no right to talk about human rights situation in any other parts of the world. That is her position. And we have a lot of friends, fortunately, because of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the respect these Congress people have for His Holiness. So we always have bipartisan, bicameral support. But then now we have to see how much traction we can gain after this act was passed, not a resolution. So we worked for almost 2 years to get this done. It's not easy to get an act passed. You have so many procedures in the House, in the Senate, and then reconciliation, and then going to the President's office. But all the 4 points that are there, one, that Tibet is yet an unresolved conflict, and of course we wanted the term conflict, but it changed into a dispute. So it's still a dispute between two countries, two nations, two peoples. It's not just a human rights issue, or it's not just a minority ethnic issues that people try to make it out to be. It's a larger issue of Sino-Tibet conflict. And now we'll have to see in the next few months, let the election get over, and then we will work with the administration to see how we can push this to other countries, like-minded countries. The idea is the more countries accept this position, not just declaring Tibet as an unresolved dispute, but also the right of the Tibetan people to self-determination, which was also there in the 1961 UN General Assembly resolution on Tibet, and not accepting China's narrative on Tibetan history, that Tibet has been part of China since ancient times. Right. His Holiness also does not accept that, and the American government also does not accept that. And then defining Tibetan territory, not just as Tibet Autonomous Region, but the other regions of Kham and Amdo, are countering China. So the whole idea is the more number of countries who accept this position, then it will put pressure on the Chinese to come and negotiate with the Tibetans. That is the whole idea.
China has a habit of renaming places. It has done so in Tibet, it has done so on the Indian territory in the northeast, especially around Arunachal Pradesh and other areas. And of course, it does not take lightly when Dalai Lama, you or other people from the CTA visit such places. How do you, in fact, see this misinformation campaign, if I can term it so, from the Chinese, and how do you plan to counter it?
This is part of their changing the historical narrative of regions or places. In fact, if you go back in time, China's hegemonistic ambitions started from then, in the late 40s and then the 50s, you know. So we were the first victims when the whole world was gaining independence from colonialism. Ironically, we came under the wave of communism that was sweeping the region at that time. About 8-9 years ago, I remember I was in the United States and China declared the air defense identification zone. Then I told our American friends, just watch. When they can claim the air, they'll claim everything underneath it, land and the sea, which is exactly what happened. So now with Taiwan, the island, they share similar language, so they don't have to use other names. With Japan also, in the Senkakus, they use Daewoo, the Chinese name, not Senkaku, the Japanese name. In the Philippines, with Spratlys and the shawls that they have, you know, all these water cannons fights going on in the sea. Also, they are renaming all the places within South China Sea. Now they have renamed parts of Arunachal Pradesh. And inside Tibet, the Chinese pronunciation, Chinese language is very different from Tibetan, and they cannot write the same thing in Chinese. So in that way also names are changing. And this change of name from Tibet to Xizang is very deliberate, very political, because their understanding, what they are trying to explain to the world is, when you say Xizang, it's only the Tibet Autonomous Region. When you say Tibet, it's the cultural Tibet or the traditional Tibet that consists of both Kham and Amdo. So they are trying to put that narrative to say that Xizang is restricted only to Tibet Autonomous Region, which is not acceptable to us. And through that, they are trying to change the history or the background of all the historical places. So this is a serious cartographic aggression that's happening, not just with Tibet, but in most of the neighboring countries. And that, how much ever China tries to deny about their hegemonistic ambitions, it reflects in how they are conducting themselves around the world. And particularly after the BRICS summit in South Africa the year before, China came out with the maps again, you know, and that infuriated a lot of the neighboring countries, from Japan to Taiwan to, you know, Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, Vietnam, now India. You know, so what China is saying and what they're doing are completely different things. And when it doesn't, for international law also, if it suits them, it's international law. If it doesn't suit them, it's not an international law. So now China's ambition is not restricted only to China. They are talking about global initiatives, global security initiatives. And within those framework, they try to define what human rights should mean for an Asian, from an Asian perspective. Right. And that they are trying to impose on the United Nations. And United Nations is almost in the hands of China, because after President Trump decided to withdraw from the human rights, the UN Refugees High Commission, China stepped in. And now they are trying to define everything in international norms, you know. And then they are talking about global economic initiative and global civilizational or cultural initiatives. So their ambition is not just restricted only to China and its neighboring countries. They are looking at the world, because they can see that they have influence in Latin America, in Africa, the global south, and now they pivot, even in terms of market, is towards the global south. But there are a lot of questions.
But are you, if I can briefly ask you, are you also planning to counter this through your own political maps of Tibet, using the traditional Tibetan names?
No, it's very important that we come out with our own searchable, internet searchable map, because even for my own people, if you look at Tibet map now, Google, and you see all these Chinese names, it's not recognizable to us. not identifiable to us. So it's imperative that we come out with our own map that's searchable on the internet, and also come out with a book to record all the historical names that were there and what China is trying to change. And for the future generations also to look at how it used to be known traditionally, not what China gave.
Right. You know, His Holiness Dalai Lama has recently returned from the US after a knee surgery. How's his health first? Because globally people are very keen to know, who follow him very religiously, and his spiritual messages. And, you know, how do you see his leadership over the years as a leader of peace, as a leader of commitment, as somebody who thousands and millions of people follow all over the globe, and about, of course, his future?
His Holiness is doing very well. In fact, I did visit when His Holiness was in US and recuperating on July 29th. And considering his age, now His Holiness is 89, going to be 90. Even for people who are a few decades younger, if they have to go through a knee surgery like that, it takes about 3 months to recover. And particularly during the COVID period, His Holiness was quite immobile because there was no movement outside, and the muscles also need to be worked on. So you have continuous physical therapy that is going on. And right now he is able to walk as much as he used to before the surgery. And according to the surgeon who did the treatment, it will take between 6 months to 1 year for His Holiness to be able to walk normally. So considering his age, His Holiness is doing very well. Now, in terms of His Holiness leadership, it's too vast for me to be able to speak about it, but I can say that His Holiness is a visionary, he's a democrat, a true democrat. Not even 1 year after coming into exile, he introduced democracy. Because as a visionary, he prepared the Tibetan community for times to come, even when he is not there. So that is why an ordinary person like myself is being able to occupy this position of Sikyong. So His Holiness has gradually, the first 30 years was difficult from 1960 to 90. Our situation was very bad. There were a lot of humanitarian issues that concerns the Tibetans, and we had no skill whatsoever, didn't understand the language, we were not used to Indian food or the climate. Many people died. Later they were put up in the foothills of Himalayas to work on road construction because that was the only thing we could do, hard labor. And in 1990, then His Holiness decided that we should have more democratization. So that was one major step by empowering the Parliament in exile to be a fully functional legislative body. Then 10 years after that, in 2001, His Holiness said, I'm semi-retired. Then 10 years after that, then he said, I'm going to devolve all my political and administrative responsibilities. Yes. So this is where we are. So if you look back, then His Holiness has been meticulously making changes according to the experience that the Tibetans are gaining. And so right now we can say that we have reached a position where ordinary Tibetans can come to the position of Sikyong or ministers or members of parliament and enable ourselves to work for our cause. Of course, with His Holiness, without His Holiness, a huge difference. It's very, very difficult to imagine another Dalai Lama of this kind, like the 14th. Even if there is a 15th, whether the 15th will enjoy the same kind of acceptance, or it's a difficult question. So right now His Holiness is thinking he's not, he doesn't have to, now that he has devolved all his responsibilities, so we are responsible for administration and the basic political things. But when it comes to China, then we seek guidance from His Holiness. Other than that, he does not interfere in any of the governance of the exiled government, but he is focused more on universal.
Yeah, he's a spiritual leader in many ways, and you're holding the political responsibility. If I can ask an additional question to this, there's a raging debate over who would be the next Dalai Lama. China has its own tricks, if I can call that. Of course, Indians are looking forward to what will happen. Americans are looking, and globally, those who follow Dalai Lama spiritually and religiously. How is this debate going to unfold, and who could it be? I am not asking you to predict, but what would be the process that would be followed, and could it be anybody? Could it be a woman? Could it be an Indian citizen? And what would be the consequences of that?
The only document that's available on His Holiness Reincarnation is the September 2011 document, wherein it states that when His Holiness reaches the age of 90, then he will consult the other High Lamas. And that is what it is. Even now, I keep saying at another 8-9 months from now, His Holiness will be 90. And even at that stage, if His Holiness feels good and if he feels that it's too early, that option is still available. So I think there has to be two parts to this. One is the protocol part. So this is something I'm always put in an awkward position, because His Holiness keeps reassuring us that he will live for another 2 decades and up to 113 years of age, because there are propitious pre-signs that this Dalai Lama will live very long, and His Holiness himself is very committed to live long, to serve humanity. So, but at the same time, of course, we are all humans. So, just like you said, every newspaper asks this question, every politician also asks this question, and China has been preparing this for a long time. As early as 2007, they passed this Order Number 5, where the communist government would be responsible for recognizing reincarnated lamas. So His Holiness always, in a very humorous, in a nice way, says that if China is really serious about reincarnation, they should study Tibetan Buddhism first, because this is very unique to Tibetan Buddhism, the system of reincarnation, and they should believe in life after death. If you don't believe in life after death, how can you look for somebody after their demise? So, and then His Holiness jokes that if China is really serious, they should look for Mao Zedong's reincarnation first, Deng Xiaoping second. Now maybe even Jiang Zemin is not with us anymore. So they can look for their own leaders' reincarnation. Sometimes you feel like, oh, the communist leaders, they don't believe in idol worship, this, that, not even religion. But in Tibet, they put up pictures of all the communist leaders in the monasteries. So do they want to be worshipped or not? So all these ironies are there, paradoxes are there, because China is always full of paradox. So what we are trying to do is that till the 14th Dalai Lama is alive, there's nothing the Chinese government could do, whatever they try to attempt. There's nothing they can do. So the CTA's responsibility is to get consensus from all the Buddhist communities, particularly the Tibetan community, and then the larger Tibetan Buddhist community that consists of Mongols or the Russian republics of Tuva, Kalmykia, and Buryat, Himalayan region. Now there are a lot more new disciples of His Holiness. So that would be one angle. And then, of course, to the international community, just like how the United States amended the 2002 Tibet Policy Act into Tibet Support Policy, Tibet Support and Policy Act of 2020, wherein they have inserted this condition on His Holiness reincarnation, that His Holiness and His Holiness alone will be responsible, not Chinese government or any other government for that matter. And we have also come out with a 6-point statement from the cabinet mentioning about His Holiness reassurance and all that. And the 6-point talks about even CTA not being involved in the process. Yeah, so we will be responsible for protocols whenever that time comes, whoever comes after me, after 10, 20 years. But then the actual process of selection of the next Dalai Lama, of course, it's wide open right now. Everything is open. His Holiness sometimes says that I could be the last Dalai Lama. He sometimes says that, it could, when he's asked, he says it could be a women Dalai Lama. They are also not very usual, not very frequent, but they are, or they were, systems of choosing emanation. Before one's own demise, you select another person as your successor. But that is not a very normal thing. And then, of course, reincarnation is also. All these options are still very open. And as a Tibetan, as a devotee of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, I have full trust in His Holiness to give a clear guidance or indications or signs or messages about his next reincarnation, if it will be reincarnation. So this is something that His Holiness has to decide. And at the age of next year, by July 6th, so it's not just getting consensus from all the Buddhist community and beyond. So we are also inviting, on a periodic basis, we also have meetings of all the head lamas of the different traditions, of the Sakyapas, the Nyingmapas, Kagyupas, Gelugpas, Chonang, Pampo, all of them. So we are going to organize a meeting on 3rd and 4th of July next year. And then on 5th, we will have a long life prayer offering, and 6th, there will be the celebration of His Holiness 90th birthday, which we want to do it internationally, call it the Year of Compassion. So let's wait for another few months before His Holiness takes a decision, instead of making too much speculations.
Sure. Yeah. I have last two questions for you. You spoke about the Tibetan monasteries and the pictures of the Chinese, leaders or dictators, if I may say. It's a situation similar to Afghanistan and Pakistan in many ways, in this context that in Balochistan, for instance, international media is banned, and we do not know how the Baloch are protesting for their freedom. In Afghanistan, after the Taliban took over 3 years ago, we do not know the situation of women, girl child education or human rights violations. In Tibet, the international media is banned. The religious rights or the kind of devotion that people have towards the Dalai Lama is not visible because of this complete ban and human rights violations. From your perspective or from your sources, because people do not know what's happening in Tibet, what is the situation right now in Tibet?
Oh, I always say we are dying a slow death. It's not visible to the world because China knows that the world needs evidence. So you are not allowed to go into Tibet. So but of course, when they have this Trans-Himalayan Forum in Tibet, they invite journalists from friendly countries, as they say, or they say we are opening up Tibet. But then if you read the small prints, then they will say gradually friendly countries. So when you say friendly countries, China is the biggest bully, then you have the smaller bullies to create a parallel or multipolar world, whatever they call it. Politically, there is no space whatsoever. So it's more like George Orwell's 1984 coming into reality, where the state surveils everything. So everybody has to turn into a digital code now. You have a number or a QR code. So China is becoming moneyless, paperless economy. So you have to use your card. They can track you on all your activities, including purchase, travel, everything. And then they are collecting DNA samples. If I commit a political action, and if I'm blamed for that, through the DNA, they can track all my relatives. Right. So they become the first target of who must have or could have collaborated with me. That also extends the ensnaring of the victimization of Tibetans who are otherwise innocent in many cases. Then movement of people have been completely, a lot of restrictions, particularly for monks and nuns. So there is no political space whatsoever. That does not exist. Religiously, in monasteries where we used to have thousands of monks, now it's reduced to 300, 400 in the big monasteries. And now children below the 18 cannot become monks. If there has to be a new novice monk entry into the monastery, you need 4 guarantors. Because if you commit a political act, these 4 guarantors will also go to jail. So it's like Hindi movie where the Dakus do all those kind of things, connecting the hero with the family, tying them up, A country is doing that to its own, if they consider Tibetans as Chinese, and they are doing to their own citizens. But Tibetans are different. And It's not like Tibetans cannot kill Chinese. But we don't do it because His Holiness always said that if you take up violence, I will no more be responsible. You know, so that Tibetans refrain from taking up violence. So now the free flow of information is not there. Movement of monks and nuns are restricted. Numbers have come down. There's constant CCTV surveillance. The communist government wants to be responsible for curriculum in monastic education. Now they want to be responsible for recognizing reincarnations, which is way beyond anybody can think, you know. So then, of course, there are huge environmental issues. Of course, with language and religion, with language, they are striking at the very root of our identity. As we discussed earlier, Tibetan script came from India, nothing to do with Chinese. And we have transliterated every available Pali and Sanskrit text from 8th to 13th century before it vanished out of India into Tibetan. So we are the only country and only language that has been preserving one part of ancient Indian wisdom. And we are very proud to be a repository of that, because that wisdom has the potential to spread more peace in the world and compassion in the world. So the situation continues to be very grave, and I say that is like python squeezing us out of our breath slowly, slowly. It's not like they're killing every Tibetan and make it a global news, but they're doing it very slow and in a systematic manner. Unfortunately, when the whole world is moving towards multiculturalism, China is the only country that's moving towards uniculturalism, unilanguage, focusing only on Mandarin. Maybe they wanted something like United States, which is a melting pot of so many people from so many different kinds of, but here you're forcing. Now, even when we talk about the colonial boarding schools where more than 1 million Tibetan children have been forced into boarding schools, kept away from their family, their language, way of life, and everything, the Chinese government denies that, you know. So there have been international reports from Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, UN Special Rapporteurs report on all this, but the amount of pressure to exert on the on the Chinese government is not taking effect because of their intransigence, you know, and imposing more. Now these are real threats, you know, the espionage, anti-espionage going to the grassroots. So it's very difficult even in Tibet today. If I meet with a friend who had been, we studied in university days, if we meet today, I will have to think many times about what I tell him, because he could report me to the authorities, or he has to be careful, otherwise I could be reporting to the authorities. You get paid for, reward for that. And it's national, and more so in the Tibetan and Uyghur areas, right? So all these restrictions, the data security law, anti-espionage law, then they also have the state secrets law, which has been amended and made more secret. Just yesterday there were news reports about China, the Communist Party, seeking allegiance from their members of 100 million or 99.4 million Chinese Communist Party members. They are rechecking their loyalty. So there is a huge deficit. That's why I keep saying China is not as monolithic and as strong as others see it. There's a lot of chinks in its armor, a lot of vulnerabilities. For example, I say in China, you are talking about 1,000-strong leadership above the rank of vice minister. Not more than 3 people can meet without the permission of the president. Not just the Politburo or the standing committee. It's about 1,000 strong leadership above the rank of vice minister. Then Xi Jinping keeps changing all the military generals from one place to another. The top leadership and the second don't trust each other. Then you have the parallel political commissars who oversees the generals. So I also say China is right now not ready to attack Taiwan yet. Because to fight a war, you need synchrony. Xi Jinping makes sure that there is no good relation between the generals and the cadres. By shifting all these generals, because he doesn't trust them. You have seen how many people have been removed from the rocket forces, or now it has extended to the Air Force and the Navy also. So these vulnerabilities, The first one is to avoid internal coup by not allowing more than 3 leaders to meet together. Second is to avoid military coup. Now the third is China is the only country that spends more money on internal security than external security. That itself manifests a deep distrust between the rulers and the rules. These are all now talk about economy, what China is going through with the housing, property market, the bankruptcy of local governments, you know, all a lot of problems, overcapacity, and now it's ongoing wrangling with the developed countries and China focusing on the global south. But then again, I said there's so many questions. How much purchasing capacity does the global south have?
Right.
And if China flood all the global south countries with all their overcapacity and cheap products, it'll kill all their small scale and medium scale industries. Only then will these countries know. Now, even now we are hearing about noises from Thailand, which is a good friend of China, from South Africa. South Africa is also now telling China, please think about a balanced trade. You know, with India also, despite all the rhetorics and the belligerence from the Chinese side on the Indian border, business has been going on. Yesterday I looked at the news, they were talking about 50 billion two-way trade. And out of that, about 41 point something is export from China to India. And India is importing that, and you are exporting only about 8-9 billion.
You know, this was going to be my last question, that you said that India should recalibrate its position on China. Now, in the context of course, the trade that is continuing, but there's been a rethink on the policy ever since Galwan happened. You know, but we've seen territorial aggression in Ladakh, in Arunachal Pradesh, along the line of actual control. I was in fact in eastern Ladakh just earlier this year, and I saw how India has made development, you know, in roads and connectivity and 5G to the last villages in Chushul and other areas. But I want to ask you, how do you want India to recalibrate its position, and how do you see this leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who has come to power now for the third time, and has of course had much regard for His Holiness Dalai Lama, has spoken to him as well.
If you go back in history, when China first started coming into Tibet in 1950, we tried to reach out to the UN, but within the UN system there are very few people who understand Tibet or who knew about Tibet.
Right.
So it was just one small country like El Salvador who brought this in with the support of US from behind, but India did not play the role that we were expecting to play at that time. Because I keep saying that when we work, when we advocate for Tibet, we have to be realistic in our expectations, because we can't expect the national interests of that country to leave aside their national interests for the interests of Tibet. That will never happen. You know, so we have to think about how do we strategize to align our interests together. Then only there will be some traction. Now, India is one country that we have relations for millennia. You know, there are also stories about the first king of Tibet having come from India. There's several versions, but that's one version. Then our language having come from, script having come from India, Buddhism having come from India, and then our four, 5 decades of Tibetan masters visiting India, learning and, you know, transcribing all that. So our relation has been cultural, historical, linguistic, religious, all that. And India is one country that understand or should be understanding Tibetan history much better than many other countries apart from China. So, and Tibetans have lived in isolation for so many centuries. So that is why India is is the most important component in resolving the Sino-Tibet conflict. But I'm nobody to advise the Indian government. So the Indian babus and the politicians will decide what is good for India. But at the same time, I mentioned about Nancy Pelosi having said that if we don't speak about Tibet, then we have no right to speak about human rights in any parts of the world. You know, and India is a democracy. It has its values based on freedom, you know, free flow of information and all that. And India should stand up for its values. It's not just enough that you have freedom here, But next door, now you have problems everywhere, whether you're talking about Tibet, most recently Bangladesh, the fight of control or influence over Nepal. Bhutan is also, Chinese are now putting a lot of pressure on the northern border. Bhutan also decided to become part of the Trans-Himalayan Forum since last year. So what's happening in Sri Lanka, Maldives, all around India, all these places you have Chinese hand. You mentioned about Balochistan. That also has Chinese hand because of Gwadar port, which was first initially meant to be a commercial port. Now it's becoming a strategic port for China. So all these are adding up to a lot of things, and there are many things on the table between India and China. The Indian government may have to consider a lot of things, because it's not the same position as India with the United States, because they are half the distance away on the other side of the world, and India has its demographic, the territorial boundary. But I would request the media and also government officials that India has still kept, you come from Kashmir, so they have still kept Indo-Tibetan border police and Indo-Tibetan border force. They have not changed it to Sino-Indian or Indo-China. That also underlines India's position on the boundary. It has always been Tibet-India border. There was never ever a China-India border. So if you use those terms, and please don't use the word Xizang for Tibet, then you are playing into Chinese hands. So these are some things that needs to be considered, and then within the Indian political leadership and the bureaucracy, of course they will think the best for India, but I think there are realization within the Indian intelligentsia also that unless the Sino-Tibet conflict is resolved, there will never be peace between India and China on the Tibetan border. So I think this needs to be taken into consideration, because now there is a lot of fluidity in the international politics. There are a lot of dynamism, things are changing, equations are changing, a lot of new formations of multilateral forums like Quad, AUKUS and all these things. A lot of military, joint military exercises are happening. So when all these are happening, and this is a good time to calibrate or recalibrate. Right. So that is best left to the Indian leadership to think about what they want to do. We cannot advise or tell the Indian government that we want you to do this. They will think about their national interest, but we will always forever be grateful to Indian government for the humanitarian assistance that have been extended to us, and to some extent political support. Otherwise, if it is not for the government and people of India, we don't exist as we are today. So we remain grateful, but to be on the pragmatic side of the realities that are happening. And if you want to be a big power, then you should be supporting the values that you also cherish. It's not enough that you enjoy the values, but others don't have, and you don't speak up for it. Then it can happen in so many different parts of the world. And then what will it? Tomorrow, if freedom knocks on your door, and then only you realize, just like Ukraine or for the Europeans, they didn't see the writing on the wall in 2014 when Crimea was invaded by Russia. Now they see it more clearly. Now they realize that, oh, Russia is the immediate threat, but the long-term challenge is China. And then some of my friends tell me, oh, China's dragon is biting at us. And I tell them, who fed the dragon to become so strong? It's Japanese, Taiwanese with all their investment, US, Europe, all the developed countries. Right. Who invested so much money, gave them technology, or they stole the technology, and now they have become so powerful, and you are complaining. But some leaders still don't learn from this experience. They still go to China and seek cooperation and all that. So the more business you give to China, we talked about India's trade balance. With Europe, they are importing 600 billion and exporting only 200 billion. They have a deficit of 400 billion every single year. Same goes with the United States and all other countries. except for few like New Zealand, Australia, Japan and Taiwan, which has trade surplus with China, all other countries have trade deficits. So with that money, they splurge it on artificial intelligence, they splurge it on space technology, military technology, assisting Russia in dubious ways to keep the Ukraine war going. Now, if you realize that, stop feeding the dragon. You complain the dragon is biting at you, but you still keep feeding the dragon, then whose fault is it? You hear about the British Prime Minister talking about, continuing with the business and talk on human rights and other things. And that's what exactly China wants. But they don't care if governments talk about human rights issues because they know they can control Tibetans or Uyghurs or Chinese people within China. So there has to be, what I say is, in terms of Ukraine also, it's very good that NATO and other countries are supporting Ukraine. They have to defend, otherwise it will have serious implications, not only in Europe, but elsewhere in China, Taiwan. It may prompt other governments to take similar actions, because this has happened with the superpowers or among the Security Council members. So the only way, I say, non-violently to bring them on their knees is give them less business. If they don't have the money to splurge on Belt and Road Initiative, creating all these dead economies and all that, then only will they listen to sense. As long as they have all this money, which used to be $3.6 trillion of foreign exchange reserve, now it might have been depleted because they are not coming out with numbers. So that, I think, is the only non-violent means to bring China on its knees, give them less business.
Well, on that note, we do hope that shared values and shared interests of both the Tibetan government in exile and India take us forward towards long-lasting peace, freedom, and of course with the blessed guidance of His Holiness. Thank you very much.
Thank you
His
so
Excellency Penpa Sharing for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.